This is Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program discussing the important crossroad of religion and life, produced by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC-TV. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues throughout our area. Now, today's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue.
Companion Through the Darkness is the title of a recently published book by Stephanie Erickson. Companion Through the Darkness is the occasion for inner dialogues on grief on today's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. Hello, I'm Richard Thompson, pastor of Central Presbyterian Church, and your host for this edition of our Interfaith Public Affairs series. And it's a privilege to have Stephanie Erickson visiting Austin at this time and available to discuss her new work with us. Hers has been a career as an author, including writing for the television series Mork and Mindy. Other books by Stephanie Erickson include Shamefaced and Recovering Together. But it's this newest book on coping with loss which has already touched a responsive chord with many who have learned how her husband had died while she was carrying their only child. And today we look forward to having her share with us in person something of the process of healing of which she writes in Companion Through the Darkness. Stephanie Erickson, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me.
And I had indicated in that introduction that the occasion for your writing this had to do with the death of your husband. Mm-hmm. Can you just fill us in a little bit more about what happened then?
We had gone through a very long period of trying to have a baby, and I had struggled with infertility for many years, and it was a miracle that I actually got pregnant, and we had a lot of hopes and dreams. And 2.5 months into that, he died very suddenly of a heart attack. And it wasn't until the autopsy that we realized that he was very, very ill, because we had no other indication of it.
I see. Mm-hmm.
My life changed immediately and suddenly, and without any consent on my part.
Mm-hmm. And in reading that book, as I had occasion to do, I've felt the passion that you had about what happened to you. I mean, it was... We'll talk about the series of feelings that you lay out there, but I mean, many people lose loved ones, but not many write books about it. What led you in that direction?
Well, I went off to find some books that would validate this feeling that I had inside, which was an incredible, tumultuous feeling. I wasn't adhering to this orderly grief process that I had heard about, that went from one stage and then to another stage, and once you were in the second stage you didn't have to go back to the first stage.
Catherine Kubler-Ross.
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, right?
Yeah.
And she, which really I don't think she ever meant to imply that it was that orderly, but along the way her writings have been interpreted by many, and I think that as a griever we think about we hope for some answers, because we are really brushing up against the ultimate question all along. We were hoping and hoping for answers. And I didn't find any. I looked and looked and looked for some indication that someone else had been on this road before.
And you didn't find that?
Very few places. I looked in a lot of books and found that they were very condescending in some ways, that they were distanced from the experience, that they told me things I really didn't need to know, like how to mix a cocktail as a widow, or how to call a plumber, and or finding God or something. I didn't feel like I needed to know that. I wanted to know that what I was going through, which seemed to me somehow sacred, was a valuable and important experience. And the condensation of these authors to me was sort of invalidating. I had the sense that I was onto something very big spiritually.
Okay, well let's delve right into it, because you talk about something sacred that you felt.
Yes.
And I think that you might just pick it up at that point in regard to what was there about your experience that you really felt needed to be shared in terms of something holy that was happening to you.
When I experienced that moment of shock, and that my life was forever changed at that moment when I found out that he was dead. I felt as if I'd suddenly had cataract surgery, and that my view of my life and the world around me was clearer than it had ever been. Now, amidst that, I was experiencing, of course, all the pain and the loneliness and the confusion, and so it was hard to keep hold of that vision or that clarity of what was really important in life now, and continue to keep that clarity. And I think that as a culture we end up exiling those of us who grieve because we don't talk about it, because we don't share really what the visceral parts of our grief are about, and we expect people to get over it within a certain period of time. We expect people to be more orderly, and it's not at all. It's not a rational process. It's not a sane process. And yet somehow in this madness, in this sort of inversion of the soul at the time, or I call it in sometimes an ego death, I found I found that I was beginning to live more and more, even though it wasn't my conceptions of what living was. It was much more painful, and my serenity wasn't necessarily without the pain and the loneliness, but it was a sense of belonging and a sense of rightness in a way I had never had before.
Okay, well, I sense that you're saying a couple of things. On the one hand, you're saying that your grief didn't fall into the neat categories of the death and dying stages of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. It was messy.
Yes, definitely messy.
Okay, well, on the other hand, you're saying that for all of the pain, there was something creative going on there.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And you were changing as a result of that. Mm-hmm. And so I'm inferring that you were not only writing in order to sort of externalize and objectify your
yes.
feelings,
mm-hmm.
but to pass on something that might have been of some value to someone else who couldn't also find in other writings what it was that you had to offer.
Well, you know, when I first started writing, it was really more to externalize my feelings, because as a writer, that's what I do, and I write. I had no idea I was writing a book. I was not writing for anybody to see this.
So it was more of a journal that you
Yes, it was my journal. It was everything that I had the urge not to say, because social propriety silenced me from talking about some taboo things like my rage or my shame or my anger at God or the amnesia that I was feeling or this madness that I was feeling. Later on, when I was able to share that with other people, and it was about 5 months after he died when I finally felt as if I need to go someplace and find someone or some validation that I'm not crazy, that I found out that everyone feels that way. First I started with women who had gone through similar experiences, who were young widows, and later on my world changed very much, and I was able to talk to a lot of people, and slowly I started to give out pieces of my writing, and people said, "This is exactly how I feel." And it was about that time when I discovered that I thought, we really need to tell the truth about grief. Someone needs to tell the truth about grief, and so I put this book together.
Okay. I've asked that we excerpt 2 or 3 of your memorable sentences here that we will share with the public. One is that I didn't choose patience, but patience chooses me. That almost sounds like you had the experience of something outside yourself, in a sense, moving in you and through you, and you were chosen in that sense. Can you expound on that a bit?
It was force-fed. It was definitely not something. I mean, if I had my way during that time, I would have moved much quicker through this whole experience. But as it was, I was inert. I was very much emotionally paralyzed, in some ways very physically paralyzed, and could not even read 2 or 3 sentences at a time. And so what I ended up doing was having to be patient, the way a person who is paralyzed physically must be patient, because there is what's the alternative? You can't move.
So in a sense, you were coming to accept the fact that it was okay for you to be paralyzed.
Yes. That was the ultimate thing. I mean, it was the only way I could deal with it. What was the alternative?
Yeah. Well, you know, I've in my work as a pastor, I've seen in people's grief reaction a tendency for folks to think, well, they have to keep going. Life keeps on moving, and I can't cry over spilt milk, and that, and to a certain extent, I have to put on a happy face.
Yes.
And all of that kind of thing, which seems to be an expression of a person's faith. God's going to make things work out for good in some way, when actually they just feel rotten.
Well, and that's their public face. And when you're in grief, what is public and what is private becomes very distinctly divided, so that it's very easy for those in grief to put on that public face because, number one, there's a feeling of shame that goes with the helplessness of the kind of loss that you feel, that something that meant so much to you. So that
shame. Now, why would you feel ashamed?
It doesn't make rational sense. But I think that when we're caught out of control, we feel exposed, we feel naked and stripped. And so there is that, it's particularly in a culture where we really do value control.
Okay.
And so here we are, we were caught out of control. And so the most amount of control we can do is keep this facade of everything is fine. Also, after a while, other people around us really would rather it was fine, because they too feel helpless, number one, or they're afraid of their own grief, and they're afraid that your grief will be contagious, and that they're going to get some of it on them. And it's true. I mean, it's very difficult to be with somebody who is in a profound, honest state of grief and not feel your own. And it's a very hard thing to do, particularly if you're not going to fix them, if you're just going to be there with them.
You wrote this other book that I mentioned at the beginning, Shamefaced.
Yes.
And I don't want to get diverted from our present book, but is there a connection there? What was that your earlier book about? How did that
Well, it was about putting words to this mute process of being sucked into a black hole inside of shame. Shame is this experience of being completely worthless, and the fear that someone will find that out. And actually, when you are ashamed, you feel as if somebody has found that out.
Okay. But the precipitating incident for your earlier book was not loss through death.
Not loss through death, but I've sustained my share of losses in my lifetime.
Yeah. I like the fact that in this book you say that grief is not something just attached to death. Grief can happen over a wide range of experiences. You can lose a lot of things in a lot of ways, and maybe not even recognize that you're suffering a grief reaction.
Exactly. You can lose your dignity. For instance, women who have gone through very abusive relationships have a lot of the same feelings. There's a great deal of shame in having allowed this to happen, or victims of violent crime, very much the same kind of reaction. Or somebody who has lost their job when they worked their entire life for a particular end in a career, and in this economic climate, that's going on a lot.
Right.
There's almost a national grief in terms of our youth and the hopelessness that they feel about their place in this world and where they're going.
Loss of the future.
Yes. And so, you know, it doesn't end divorce, loss of your own physical health. There's, you know, it seems to me, even though I didn't intend to write this for a universal audience, it does seem, what I hear back from readers is that they have found their way of applying it to their particular situation.
Well, I've been impressed, but one of the best-selling books on the market in the religious field is called Good Grief, by a fellow named Granger Westberg, who speaks about it in the context of the church. And that's the point that he makes, is that people begin to suffer loss from the beginning of their lives.
Yes.
It's a lifelong process, and in various ways little kids know about it. I remember having to give away a dog when we moved. My earliest remembrance of grief was just seeing that dog being taken down the street. And I think that, you know, it's well for folks to know that's part of living, and it's, I think you said in your book, that's maturity.
Well, I believe that too. My daughter, we just put our dog down, and my daughter cried one night. It was a couple of months afterwards, and she said, "Mommy, I'm sad with myself." And I said, "What about?" She said, "I really miss our dog." And it was 2 or 3 months before she really got that he wasn't coming back. And I think that that's a very natural experience. It's not just a child's experience. I think that even as adults, it takes us a long time before we really get the permanence of loss.
Well, I think that when we come back, we'll have a chance to go into something of the religious aspect of this, because there's a part of your book that touches on that, and that's, of course, our program has to do with the faith community here in Austin, and I'd like to visit with you about that. If we can just pause for a minute to take a break, we'll be right back to continue our looking at Companion Through the Darkness, as written by Stephanie Erickson. We're back on Austin Faith Dialogue with the conversation with Stephanie Erickson, I'm sorry, and Companion Through the Darkness, your new book on dealing with grief. Stephanie, I said before we just took the break about your having a quote in there. I'm going to have them bring it up on the monitor because it's a real challenge to those of us in the religious community, about how you found I fired God a particular day. How did you do that, and why?
Well, I do say in that particular chapter that the grieving have moments of omnipotence, and I'm sure that part of that was me duking it out with the cosmos. And
sort of like Job?
Yes.
Yeah.
And decided that any God that would take my husband away from me at this moment when we had so much to look forward to was not a God I wanted to have anything to do with. That lasted for a while. It was nice to have the power to be able to do that. It was sort of empowering, even though I knew that God was strong enough for me to be able to fire him. And like I said it once again, you know, being the omnipotence in my grief, I reinstated God as well back into my life, because it ended up to be a very, very lonely time without some sort of sense of a power greater than myself in this world.
So by the time you worked through your anger in relation to God, you had room, in a sense, for a new relationship. It sounds like that.
Yes.
You weren't expecting God to just answer your questions automatically or resolve your grief automatically. It was. I guess as a pastor, that's another thing that I get constantly is why me?
Yes.
And I'm going to try a couple answers that I give to that. Sometimes I say, well, first of all, why me in the first place? You know, here on earth. I mean, it's just lucky for us to be here, to have life to begin with. There's another one that is can't remember where I read this, but it said, why not me?
Yes.
Since everyone is suffering.
Right.
Why should I be exempt?
Yeah.
Or like John Keats talked about this being our suffering, the veil of soul making. Why try me? I think it was Bernie Siegel in his book on cancer and medicine.
Love, Medicine, and Miracles?
Yes.
Yes.
I think he's the one
book.
that said that. Let this be the occasion for me to become what I wouldn't otherwise.
Exactly. There's a quote in Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, where he talks about existentialism, and he says basically that his survival mechanism was, if it doesn't kill me, it'll make me stronger. And why not me is an interesting kind of response to that, because later on I began to think that perhaps this event was the way that my angels were basically guiding me to a lesson that I needed to learn, to a greater sense of my real soul's authenticity, and to know more about myself, to become more genuinely who I am, and to shed a lot of the belief systems and that I had adapted because I am a member of this culture, that really didn't have much to do with me. You know, to really begin to tell the truth about it. It's like for me, the most important thing in my life really is relationships and loving and being in a relationship, for instance, with my children and my family. And yet I had not honored that value. I had worked very hard. I had put those people that I loved, you know, sort of in the background,
Oh, is that
and
right?
you know, ignored them and gone on to work very hard for other people rather
I
than
see.
for myself.
Okay, so it redefined your values in
Definitely.
regard to your relationships.
Yes.
And you saw that
redefined
as,
me.
and that had something, redefined your own identity.
Yes.
And that had something to do with an experience of a power greater than yourself as well?
I think that the power greater than myself gave me a sense of that there was some mystery out there that I didn't have to know.
Okay.
That I was allowed to stumble around in this darkness to find my way, and that I was also allowed to listen within and for the direction that I needed to find.
Okay.
I don't think of it as really a religious experience as so much as my own deeply personal spiritual quest, what I personally needed to know. And that's a lot different than saying, well, it was meant to be, which is a very cruel thing to say,
Really?
because you say, well, who meant it to be? Who didn't consult me? You know, this is my life.
I think folks are well-intentioned when they say, well, it was meant to be, or God's will, or some sort of theological formula for what is a mystery.
Yes.
And what I hear you saying is that you came through this with with kind of getting rid of some of this baggage that wasn't making any sense to you anymore. And yet you were going on with some new spiritual resources that I think is evident in your book.
Yes, there was this ferocity that I began to feel. Perhaps it's because I have a natural irreverence to authority or to social rules and mores, and I was able to, you know, sort of fight that. And that was a very important part of my recovery, was to be able to say, I don't buy that I'm supposed to be like Jackie Kennedy at John's grave and be dignified about this. It doesn't feel dignified. And it was in that sort of irreverence that I was able to begin to learn more about myself. And also to be, you know, the ferocity of saying, well, wait a minute, I'm not guaranteed I get tomorrow. I'm not guaranteed anything in this life. I don't know anything for certain, and that's the only thing I know for certain. And so in that, then my sense of immediacy began to take over, and living in the present, living today, and taking care of the things today became more of a priority to me than it had ever been before.
I'd like to share with our viewers one other quote from the book that I think as you got into the question of coping, you define limbo as unable to let go for fear of losing what little we have. And as distinct from the theological view of limbo, this is a very practical one where people find themselves not knowing in some cases whether a person is dead or not.
Right.
You mentioned one example of that in there. And that you almost say that limbo is worse than hell. That's what I hear.
I think it is. I went through it as a child when my father disappeared when I was 7 years old, and I didn't find him again until I was 19, and there was 12 years of wondering, is he alive, is he dead, being afraid to mourn him because if I was afraid that if I mourned him, that would really say that he was dead, that would really acknowledge that he was dead, and perhaps he wasn't. But it is worse than hell in a sense that you keep this string of hope, this thread that you're hanging on to constantly, and you never get to mourn, although you have all those feelings inside, but you're staving it off. It's a very difficult...
Unresolved.
Yes.
Unresolved grief.
Yeah.
Well, I think that one of the things that, as we seek to resolve our discussion today, is just to back off for a moment and look at how we reconcile the parts of your life. I introduced you at the beginning as a writer for Mork and Mindy.
Yes.
And here you are writing about passing through the valley of the shadow of death.
Yeah.
And help us pull this together in terms of who you were, who you are, and where you hope to be. I mean, you're in the media. You've Do you see that your work in the media has been a means of helping people come to these realizations, even in the kind of situation comedies that you were writing about?
Well, you know, it's funny that most people don't realize this because comedy writers like to keep this a secret, but a great deal of what makes us laugh really comes from profound pain. Mm-hmm. And usually, if it doesn't have a real thread of truth in it, it's not going to be funny. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I found in going through my grief experience was that laughing was, as I say in there, my window into sanity.
Yes.
I have a chapter called Laughing Resuscitation where I talk about the value of laughter, that humor was the backside of agony for me, and that I was able to finally find this power or an empowerment and a bond with other people when I could laugh, and I could laugh with someone about that. And it really felt as if it was mouth-to-mouth resuscitation in a sense.
Well, you've given us both a sense of your humor and a sense of your profound insight that we really appreciate. You're
Thank you.
taking the time to do this. Harper Collins, Companion Through the Darkness at your local bookstore. And as we thank Stephanie Erickson for taking these moments to be with us on Austin Faith Dialogue to reflect her inner dialogues of grief, we want to thank you folks for joining us today. Hope you'll be with us again next week. I'm Richard Thompson on behalf of Austin Metropolitan Ministries. Peace be with you. For more information, call